Morning, everybody. Thank you, Jack. What a pleasure it is to be back. Thank you, Brad. We love working with the CCS Institute. And you're right, turning big ideas into action. And we're talking today about a big idea. And I think the way you put it, Jeff's absolutely right in terms of the entire atmosphere is different today from what it has been. So CCS 2020, the end of the beginning, what does that mean? Well, how do I get this to move forward? There we go. Do I have to point it over here?
No.
No. Okay. So it's November 1942. You don't remember that, do you, Brad? But you know, basically every single battle of World War II had been lost. We just had to pull all the troops out of Dunkirk, and then in Egypt, Battle of Egypt, Alamein, the Allies won. And Winston Churchill addressed Parliament, and he said, "This is victory." He said, "But it is not the end." He said, "It's not the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." And that's exactly where we are with CCS today. Now, just sort of looking back, as you were saying, Jeff, it's been a very remarkable decade that we've left. At one level, the decade was it started with this incredible techno-optimism. So this is Time Personality of the Year 2010. Mark Zuckerberg, 25 years old. 10 years later, Personality of the Year, a 16-year-old. A very, very different message. A chastened civilization after 10 years. At one level, hugely successful. You had, global GDP up massively during the decade. You had poverty reduction that was one of the most successful in the history of the world. So a great decade. The energy business drove that. Thank you. These people wouldn't have come out of poverty without the corporations in this room. But the price we paid was pretty high in terms of the earth. Those of you that read your Bible, it talks about the earth groaning. And that's what's been happening over the last 10 years. The hottest days ever in history, the strongest storms ever recorded in history, higher seas than ever recorded in history, fiercer fires than ever recorded in history, longer droughts. And of course, in all of this, the poorest are those who are hit hardest. So when we talk about climate change, this is a moral issue. It's about those who get impacted. People in this room will be impacted, but nowhere near as much as these people. The World Bank estimates 100 million people could be pushed back into poverty because of climate change. So this is a very, very serious thing. What we're doing in this room today is a serious business that humanity has to challenge. And so, as you know, by far the hottest decade in history, 19 of the 20 hottest years ever recorded happened in the first 19 years of this century. And of course we know why. Just over the last century, we've seen a tenfold increase in carbon emissions. In the last 10 years, we have emitted more than we emitted in the 200 years, 1750 to 1950. So we're heading in the wrong direction. We now are at 415 parts per million, up from 280 at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? But the last time we had 415 was 3 million years ago, when it was 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in the world, and the sea level was 30 to 60 feet higher. And of course, we're blowing right past that 415. I mean, if we could stop it, okay, maybe we could adjust, but we're not. It's going up every single year. And that's why the Paris deal was so important in 2015, and many of you in this room have been very involved in it. It was that brief interlude in the middle of the century where we actually thought maybe human beings could get together and solve problems together. It turned out that didn't last, and we have a very weak sense of collective global action at the moment. Now, the deal under the Paris Accord is that you come back 5 years later and you ramp up your level of ambition. And that's what's going on right now. So far, 108 countries have said we are going to increase the ambition to 2030 of what we stated in Paris. Unfortunately, those are mainly small countries. they add to only 15% of the total carbon emissions. So there's huge questions going on right now in terms of, what will China do, what will India do, what will Europe do, what will the United States do, and so on. So this is an absolutely crucial year where there is all to play for. So just to remind people, this is where we are today. These are the emissions today. This is where we need to be 10 years from now if we are going to have a chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5. This is where we're heading now under the ambition of the Paris deal. So every country had a so-called NDC. If all of those are implemented, this is where we will be. So you can see we're heading in the wrong direction, albeit had we not had it, we would be way up there. And by the way, this is where we need to be in 2050. It's what science tells us. So that sort of, frames the challenge. And of course, you've all seen charts like this from the IPCC, which show the incredible, this is 2020, this is the scale that we have to do. Now, what's it got to do with CCS? Well, it's two things. One, we cannot come down at this pace without carbon capture and storage. So thank you for those in the fossil fuel business that are investing in this, and I'm looking forward to hearing Jason after me from Shell. And number one is that. Number two is this, which is that we now know, because of the IPCC report and because of a huge amount of science, that actually it's not good enough to stop emitting. We actually have to take a great deal of carbon out of the atmosphere. What's that got to do with CCS? Well, everything, because whilst a tree is the best form of CCS, it will only do maybe a third of what is needed. And so what we need to do is put a lot into storage, whether from direct air capture, whether from BECCS, or whatever. So where are we now on the journey? So phase one, do you remember? It was sort of, if you like, 2008 to 2011. All of you that were in the business then will remember just how heady it was. I was working for the British government then, and I was on the cross-Whitehall senior officials decision-making body on energy. And Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister. He said, take $1 billion, put it into CCS. This is the most important thing. And the Prime Minister was briefed. Everybody was briefed. It was the most exciting technology. And we were all talking about it. And as you know, so we had $1 billion, and 7 years later, the $1 billion was cancelled. It was never spent whatsoever. So there was that sort of innocent years, if you like. And then we had, if you like, the rough patch. And that's really been the period from 2012 to 2018. Pretty grim time. But actually, it wasn't as desperate. This is, it's a picture of you, right? No, it's not. No. This is where people in this business faithfully plodded on. It wasn't as desperate as this. It was more like this, actually. It was more like sowing seeds. If you look at a field in winter, it always looks pretty drab. It looks like nothing's happening. But actually what's going on in a field in winter is very important. So this is the positive spin on the last few years. And of course you capture this in this. Be the way, the report you did this year is really terrific. I hope you've all seen it. It's really good. And I assume you will be talking about it later today. So this captures that kind of the lean years, if you like, or the field in winter. So these are all the commitments. These are the advanced development, early development up here. This is the actual construction, what's been going on. It's pretty grim, even to 2019, but you see it's starting to come up. And that's what I want to talk to you about briefly now, and that's what the theme of the entire day should be, which is how do we get, not to 19, which is what you have now, how do we get to the 10,000 that we were talking about? How do we get that revolution, that positive tipping point? That's what we should be talking about. And so phase 3, which is where we are today, is poised for takeoff. And we need to have a pretty sophisticated discussion, politically, financially, economically, psychologically, technologically, about what it would take for this takeoff to be truly successful. And the trick will be finding allies. like so many things in life, this problem is not going to be solved by solo pioneers. Occasionally that works, but it won't work this time, I don't believe. So who are the allies? Well, yesterday we had a great meeting with some utilities. Remarkable, the demand side for this now. So utilities in this country, despite Mr. Trump, are coming through with incredibly ambitious goals. They can't achieve those without CCS. Who are the other allies? Well, the business community is absolutely becoming your ally. You may have seen this chart before. Once a year, the World Economic Forum asks 1,000 CEOs among the top 1,000 companies in the world, tell us what you're most worried about in the coming 10 years, and tell us how bad it will be if it happens, and tell us how likely it will be. And they're given a choice of 50, so you can choose an energy price shock, state collapse, unemployment, fiscal crisis, financial failure. So this is what you want to look at. This is what they're worried about, both in terms of probability and in terms of outcome. And what is that? This is the top right-hand corner. They're not worried primarily about cyber security or trade wars or the next recession or coronavirus, although this was taken before coronavirus, must admit. They're worried about extreme weather, they're number one. Failure to address climate, biodiversity loss, natural water crises. So they are getting it. They're getting it in a very big way. And anyone who was in Davos this year, 50th anniversary of Davos, obsessive about this. They all now know, well, not all of them, but a lot of them now know that their long-term viability and the health of their growth will depend upon the ability to address that. So they are your big allies, and we need to be mobilizing them. Another group that is becoming a very important ally are the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. And just in the last year, there's been a remarkable change, if you like, in terms of the attitude towards the hard-to-abate sectors. You know, for 15 years, we've sort of been saying, well, we know how to decarbonize power, and we know how to move sort of in the right direction, but there's a whole part of the economy, accounting for maybe 20%, that actually is just hard to abate. And so we'll get to that later. You know, it's the cements, the steel, the airlines, heavy transport, the international shipping, and so on. Well, a lot of work's being done just in the last year. It turns out actually the hard to abate sectors are not quite as hard to abate as we thought. The Energy Transitions Commission has come out with some really interesting work showing that actually industrial countries can decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors by 2050, developing countries by 2060. It will cost about half of 1% of GDP. They can't do it without carbon capture and storage. Some of them can, but many of them cannot. And one of the really interesting things, back just mentioning Davos again this year, is that actually for the first time ever, you had the airline industry meeting to talk about decarbonization. You had cement and you had steel meeting as industrial groupings talking about how do we decarbonize. They are allies for you in the carbon capture and storage. And so as we talk about sort of what the strategy should be moving forward, they should be mobilized. Financial sector is becoming a great ally, potentially, of you. Again, I mean, much more than anybody anticipated, the financial sector is starting to understand the very profound risks that exist from climate change. And there's two kinds of risks from climate change. One is if climate change happens, it will hurt your industry. Second, if government takes very strident policies against climate change, that will hurt your industry in the form of stranded assets. So, this is Larry Fink, who runs the biggest fund in the world. BlackRock wrote the most famous letter just last month, basically saying, look, the entire financial system will be changed as a result of climate change. Climate change is driving a fundamental reshaping of finance, a profound reassessment of risk and asset values. In the near future, there will be a significant reallocation of capital. These guys who have been absolutely unhelpful to you, those in the carbon capture and storage. Why? Because the financial sector is not a friend of the environment. Why? Because they have short-term perspectives, and because they're conservative, and if you're conservative, you like financing things you've always financed, you're asking them to finance something that's quite different and quite new. This is shifting their calculus that they will be working on. And by the way, you now have leadership in the financial industry, or this is the financial regulatory industry. I mean, for example, Christine Lagarde, who was head of the IMF, she's now head of the European Central Bank, absolutely driven by concern, by recognition that climate change is a massive threat to the world financial system. Kristalina Georgieva, who is was the CEO of the World Bank, now she's head of the IMF, absolutely and utterly, we met with her for a half a day last week to talk about how the IMF, in its Article 4 surveillance, would actually put climate change and issues of stress testing in the very heart of what the IMF does. Who would ever have imagined the IMF would put this central? And the reason they do is because they believe it is a threat to the stability of the financial system and a threat to the stability of the economy of the world. These guys are potentially huge allies. They all know what is required. They know that carbon capture and storage is going to be required. And by the way, Kristalina, who's now head of the #1 financial institution in the world, she, just by chance, succeeded me 20 years ago as director of the environment department of the World Bank. So you've got actually an environmentalist running the IMF, which is quite surprising. And leading up to the meeting in Glasgow, you've got just remarkable things going on with the financial sector. This is Mark Carney. He is governor of the central bank. He's now been appointed as UN Special Envoy for Climate and Finance. He understands this very well. He should be mobilized to be a real ally so that when we get to this once in 5-year meeting in Glasgow in November, the financial sector is totally behind financing CCS. So where are your other allies? Well, what about these guys? You just came back from, Brad, from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are hosting the G20 this year. Are they going to put climate change on the agenda? Not as climate change, but for heaven's sake, carbon capture and storage ought to be central in what the G20. They should put climate change on the agenda, of course, but it's these two gentlemen in the middle. I don't think particularly want to make that the highest priority. But what about the G7? I love this picture, don't you? You know, what are they looking at? This is my Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I think he's in the right place. But this year, Donald Trump is hosting the G7. They will address some very important issues. He said, we absolutely are not going to put climate change on the agenda, but why not? Why not have a massive push on carbon capture and storage, which clearly is in the Trump administration's interest. Now there is, for the first time ever, finance ministers formed a coalition to address climate change. Traditionally, you know, you'd have an environment minister come in and they would say, look, to the cabinet meeting and would say, look, we want to raise the level of ambition of our Paris commitment. And the finance minister traditionally would say, oh, it's going to cost way too much. So no, don't go there. These guys are actually saying, no, there's a new economics, an economics of the 21st century, which basically says if you want a healthier economy, you do need to be aggressive using smart policies on climate, not foolish policies, but smart policies on climate. These guys, all of them, would understand what you're trying to talk about today. At least they need to understand it, and they're going to play an important role in the lead-up to Glasgow as well. So, still in the business of seeking allies in this most important of year. How do we make that takeoff actually take off and not go back to the gloomy years? 4 years makes a big difference. I mean, 4 years ago, institutions like ours, the World Resources Institute, were receiving calls and visits from the Democratic Party saying, look, when Mrs. Clinton becomes president, we promise you she will address climate change, but please, please don't thrust the issue of climate change into the election. It is a vote loser. That was the message 4 years ago. These guys are falling over themselves trying to outperform each other on climate change. Why? Because climate change is now a vote winner. And we need to get these guys in the right place, and they're not all in the right place, on carbon capture and storage yet. And by the way, November 3 is a very important day. That's the election. We are non-partisan, so I won't tell you who we would vote for. But November 4th is also important, because that's when the United States pulls out of the Paris deal legally. It's the first time legally they can do it after 2015. And then the next week, the once in 5 year climate negotiations start. So, you know, this week is very important, not only for the United States, but actually for the world. And you can imagine, actually, a very, very different outcome according to who is president. And finally, in terms of sort of allies, we have something now that we've never had before. We have citizens out on the street. I mean, 7.6 million people in 1 week in 186 countries were out there protesting for climate change, and it's not going away. They're more and more and more and more. At the moment, obviously, the young people are not particularly interested in carbon capture and storage, but there is a trick to engage with them, to not just the young people, obviously, it's the labor unions are now heavily involved, and all kinds of other groups as well, engaging with them on the arithmetic of climate change, so that at least there's not a massive opposition to carbon capture and storage, is very important. So just finally, we do a lot of work on what does it take to get a sort of a positive tipping point? Why do certain things that weren't going anywhere suddenly happen? Why do things always take much longer than you ever expect to happen, but then they happen much more quickly than you ever imagined? What causes that tipping point? And we've looked at lots of positive tipping points, you know, whether it's the fact that 150 countries suddenly reformed their economies between 1985 and 2000. You know, there's no evidence they were going to do it. They suddenly all did it in 15 years. Radical, revolution. Lots of, why did it take 21 years for the United States to phase out of lead in gasoline, and then accelerated to all the countries in the world in the next 15 years. It became unstoppable. What causes those things? One of the most important things is the notion of sort of coalitions of leaders and multi-stakeholder partnerships, which doesn't really exist in carbon capture and storage yet. And something that, whether it's governments, the people, the technology, business, finance, all of them, their leaders need to engage. We call it, that's collective action. When we talk about collective action, we normally talk about one country working with another country. But actually it's one group of people, one set of actors working with other sets of actors. It's what we call the ambition loop. Governments won't do the most ambitious things unless they're confident that their business community will support them. Businesses won't do a lot unless they know if their bankers and their financiers will do it and that there's technology available. Governments will be empowered when their citizens tell them what to do, and so on. It's what we call an ambition loop. That is what is required if we're going to have the revolution, which, quite frankly, the energy change will be a revolution. So too, quite frankly, our food and agriculture needs a revolution. So too our manufacturing systems, moving from make waste to circular systems, need a revolution. None of them are going to happen unless we get this kind of ambition loop. Let me just make one obvious point that those of you in the technology business know. Some people say, oh, for heaven's sake, things will take forever. There's only 1% of vehicles at the moment that are electric, so it'll take 100 years before they become no, actually, it's not how it works. If you actually look at new innovations, this is 1900 up to today. This is electric power. Within 20 years, 70% of homes are electrified in the United States. This is a refrigerator. Within 10 years, 70% of all homes in America got refrigerators. This is automobiles, a little bit slower. This is color TV. You know, literally within 10 years, another 75% suddenly got color TV. And this is the internet, as you can imagine. So when people say, well, there's 19 carbon capture and storage plants in operation today, actually we need 10,000 if we're going to have the 10 gigatons that are required. Don't believe it that it's impossible. It's not impossible. You just need the technology, needs to be clear, people need to understand what it is, decision makers need to get thrilled with the revolution. You think about the two revolutions of the electrification of the economy and then the decarbonization of electricity, and so too the decarbonization of the fossil fuel industry. These are profoundly exciting transitions, and we need to get politicians and citizens excited about that. So just in closing, we're going to have to take some risks. I'm not sure. By the way, this is Fiona. Fiona actually did these slides. Thank you, Fiona. So if you like them, give her the credit. If you don't like them, it's my fault. This is to capture, actually, at times, if we're going to be successful, we're going to feel a little out of control, quite frankly. But we're only going to win the gold medal if we're willing to go to the edge and take the kinds of risks. And so phase 4. So phase 1, Snoopy dancing. Phase 2, you know, plowing through the mud. Phase 2, takeoff, the bird, you know, not sure where it's going to make it. Phase 4, that's where we need to get to. That's what this meeting today is all about. And just a word of encouragement. You know what this is? 50 years ago, this April, no, Woodstock was more fun. No, this was the first. It does look like Woodstock, that's right. There they had the mud as well. There's a picture of the guy in the mud is more like wood. So you know, leading up to this, you know, we had Silent Spring, we had, you know, the Ohio Canal on fire. First Earth Day. Within 3 months of the first Earth Day, maybe you can just press that. Did you press the next one? Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you. Can you move forward? Oh, there you go. So within 3 months of the first Earth Day, we had the EPA created, we had the Clean Air Act, we had the Clean Water Act 2 years later, the Endangered Species Act. All of it, by the way, under a Republican president who was not a member of the Sierra Club, Richard Nixon. And if you ask leading environmentalists today and you say, who are the greatest presidents on the environment? Number 1, Teddy Roosevelt, Republican. Number 2, Richard Nixon. He wasn't particularly interested in the environment, but he realized that the citizens wanted it, and it sort of made sense. So it was the greatest period of environmental rulemaking in the United States. Some of you would like to see some of these watered down, but it is encouraging. And so I leave you with this final picture. This is, when I showed this before, someone said he's burying the tapes. But no, this is him actually. His wife is planting a tree. So, you know, great things can happen, and this is the tree being built. So the tide is turning, as you said in a very good article in Politico recently, Brad. The tide is turning. It needs to really become overwhelming, and we need to surf it rather than be drowned by it. So 2020, the tipping point, we're counting on you. Thank you very much.